And so this evening, I'm going to begin with another of the letters that's been provided to me by Louis LaFontaine of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology page on Facebook. And this is a letter which Louis called Carl Jung, "To be sure, Christ gave the myth a new meaning for the man of antiquity." And so I'm just going to read through this letter as a warm-up, and then we'll get on with the excitement of the evening, which will be a discussion of the collective unconscious and election 2018. So this is a letter to Dr. Dorothy Hoch, H-O-C-H, and it's dated 23 September 1952. And this letter is in keeping with Dr. Jung's feelings about how he had been treated by theologians for a long time. Dear Dr. Hoch, you are quite right. In my last letter, I said very much more than was warranted by your sermon. The theologians pick on me so much and misunderstand me so dismally that it would be unnatural if I didn't let off steam occasionally. But it was not meant personally. If I stress the historical evolution of Christianity, this does not mean that I overlook the news it brings. I only want to smooth the transition so that the meaning of the message can be understood. People are so different. Recently, an elderly Swiss clergyman wrote me a touching letter emphasizing that through my writings, I had at last opened the way to the Bible for him. I certainly never expected anything like that. But you can see from this that the figurative language of the Bible is not understood even by clergymen. No doubt the archetypes are present everywhere, but there is also a widespread resistance to this mythology. That is why even the gospel has to be demythologized. To be sure, we are dealing with the meaning and content of mythologems. To be sure, Christ gave the myth a new meaning for the man of antiquity. I'm just going to turn this sound down a little bit. But when we still go on stressing the newness 2,000 years later, we must point out what exactly is the news for us, which we haven't yet heard and understood. Then we could feel like primitive Christians again. But we hear only the same old words and, like Bultmann, get sick of mythology. How far is the message new for us? How far is Christ still unknown to us? We heard ages ago that he exists as a living person exempt from our arbitrariness and all the rest of it. What we need is a new point of departure, and this cannot be found without the assignment of new meaning. The message is alive only if it creates new meaning. I don't believe at all that it has run dry, rather that theology has. Just how do you make it clear to your listeners that, quote, the death and resurrection of Christ are their death and their resurrection, unquote? Aren't you equating Christ with the self of man? And isn't this a view which is contested when I say it? If the death and resurrection of Christ are my death and resurrection, i.e., if A equals B, then B equals A. That Christ is the self of man is implicit in the gospel, but the conclusion Christ equals self has never been explicitly drawn. This is an assignment of new meaning, a further stage in the incarnation or actualization of Christ. You are drawing near to this insight with rapid steps. Indeed, you have already voiced it. And with it, Christ becomes a formulable psychological experience. The self is a living person and has always been there. It is an insight upon which Hindu philosophy, the equivalent of Western theology, Buddhism, Taoism, mystical Islamic sects, and Christianity are all agreed. My psychology is a modest contribution to this illustrious assemblage, and from the Christian standpoint, you have formulated the essential psychological principle in the words quoted above. Thanks to this insight and inner experience, the figure of Christ has come alive for you and means for you an ultimate and unshakable truth because it issues from a universally disseminated collective archetype. Every Christian should rejoice, but I fear the theologians will make a sour face. I, however, rejoice that the unconscious has put into your mouth the true meaning. As you may know, I have written in detail about this in Ion and Answer to Job and other works. It goes without saying that I am not of the opinion that insights which only the individual can have should be preached. I realize that the sermon is a pressing affair for the clergyman, something he has to cope with somehow. But his psyche is perhaps an even more pressing task, and it is of this I speak. In this respect, there is a general flight outwards, a wrinkling of the nose at psychology, a terrifying ignorance of it, and the cura animarum has reached its nadir. Instead, one goes in for missions to the heathen. The first emissaries went into the great centers of civilization, but not to the sources of the Nile. That came in only with monasticism, which sprang from a disgust with the civilized world from which one had dropped out. A good example is Albert Schweitzer, who is urgently needed in Europe but prefers to be a touching savior of savages and to hang his theology on the wall. We have a justification for missionizing only when we have straightened ourselves out here. Otherwise, we are merely spreading our own disease. How is it with God's kingdom in Europe? Not even savages are stupid enough to see our lies. Not even savages are stupid enough not to see our lies. Shamelessly and childishly, we parade our irreconcilable schisms before the wondering eyes of our black brethren and preach peaceableness, brotherliness, neighborly love, etc., through the mouths of evangelists, Lutherans, High Church, Nonconformists, Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, all of whom are resolved to the death not to communicate with their brother. Is this fulfilling God's will? These thoughts come to me unbidden when you speak of total commitment, for instance, to missionary work. Of course, people can be committed to everything and anything, even to Nazism, as we have seen. But whether the goal presupposed by us to be right also corresponds to God's will is another matter. About this only a very small, still voice within us gives us any information, and not infrequently it contradicts our collective ideals. That is the way it called certain prophets. One of the greatest obstacles to our psychic development, it seems to me, is the drowning out of the inner voice in the interests of some collective conventional ideal, which makes us insensitive to the damage done to our own house and gives us the right to impart good advice to our neighbors. If we go along with a so-called good cause, we can easily give ourselves the treat or not having to do something to improve our oh-so-small and insignificant psyches. But that the right means in the hands of the wrong man, then work mischief, is something nobody thinks of. Don't you think we would have more cause to worry about the state of Christianity in Europe than about hygienic precautions in and about Lamborghini? The first is naturally highly unpopular, for the second is exemplary idealism, which guarantees a first-class good conscience and nowhere tarnishes the lordly feeling of the white man. Please don't take my remarks personally, but for what they are footnotes to the religious question of the present. Please don't take my remarks personally, but for what they are, footnotes to the religious question of the present. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. P.S. I really owe you an explanation why it is that I bombard you with such a long and repellent letter. I have, you see, to listen to so much idiotic and negative stuff about Christianity on the one hand, and am so grotesquely misunderstood by the theologians on the other, that I do my utmost to bring my criticism to bear only when I can count on goodwill, i.e., on a truly Christian attitude, which may have not a little to do with neighborly love. Besides that, your last letter has also moved me to show you how closely your religious views touch my own. And this is from Carl Jung's Letters, Volume 2, pages 83 to 86. Okay, so there's my warm-up for tonight. And I will look for comments or questions if you have any on that. I'm going to move this off the screen and center myself. Okay. All right, so tonight I foolishly agreed to talk about the collective unconscious and election 2018. And this is not going to be a party line harangue by any means. I'm only trying to put into your hands information about what Dr. Jung was seeing as a way to help you understand what's going on in the United States. Certainly, it's definitely true that our talking heads have really no clue and have not had since the election of our president. So anyway, the reference tonight is, I will show it to you. The reference tonight is 2 essays on analytical psychology by C.G. Jung, and it is volume 7 of the collected works. The first of these essays was written in 1916, so you can decide for yourself just how prescient Dr. Jung was about our current situation as we go through the evening. So reference References to 2 essays on analytical psychology, Volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, published by Princeton University Press and in England by Routledge and Kegan Paul Limited. On the Psychology of the Unconscious, first edition was 1916. Okay, so in paragraph 32, I'm going to give you a few preliminaries here. In paragraph 32, man thrives only when spirit and instinct are in right harmony. If one or the other aspect is lacking to him, the result is injury, or at least a lopsidedness that may easily veer towards the pathological. Too much of the animal distorts the civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals. That's from paragraph 32 of this volume 7. And it's one of my favorite quotes. Also, I might mention that I have a big set of notes for tonight, and I have posted them in the general group Dropbox under handouts, and then in the folder that's called 080618, and in there you will find my notes in case you want to download them and look at them while I'm talking. And if you are not a member of our Dropbox, please send me a email address and I will add you to our Dropbox. Okay, so in paragraph 41, he sort of reiterates the same idea. He says, man can suffer only a certain amount of culture without injury. The endless dilemma of culture and nature is always a question of too much or too little, never of either or. Remember when you... Then in talking about election 2018, I'll just mention something that I said 2 years ago in session 3 of year 1 of the group, where I said something to this effect. Remember when you were sent to the principal's office, the experience engendered a certain resentment. The disobedient kid with the heart of gold, perhaps. The Fonz. Right? Okay. Well, that's what election 2016 was about, as I predicted 2 years ago before the election. And what it is that our president wants to break all of our norms. I mean, there isn't a day since then that I haven't awakened to a news report that our president is breaking something else in our government or in our relations around the world or whatever it is. And so for a lot of people, they go, yeah, okay, because they still have that resentment from when they went to the principal's office, and they've always had somebody's thumb on them. And so they like seeing the establishment twist in the wind. There's no doubt about that. And so so they're very happy about it, but they don't know why. And so hopefully by the end of this evening, at least you will have some idea of why. So in paragraph 103, Dr. Jung says, we have to distinguish between a personal unconscious and an impersonal or transpersonal unconscious. We speak of the latter also as the collective unconscious because it is detached from anything personal and is common to all men, since its contents can be found everywhere, which is naturally not the case with the personal contents. And I just remind you that when Dr. Jung is talking about the transpersonal unconscious, that also amounts to the self, and it also amounts to the God image in Jungian psychology. Although, by the way, he wasn't talking about that 102 years ago when he was writing this particular essay, because that came in his later work, maybe 40 years later, 35 years later or so. And he hadn't even started on alchemy. So, so just to describe the personal unconscious, contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, i.e. forgotten on purpose, subliminal perceptions, by which are meant sense perceptions that were not strong enough to reach consciousness, and finally, contents that are not yet ripe for consciousness. Now, just for your information, in my view, there's another layer between the personal unconscious, or let's say the personal unconscious is the lower layer and the societal unconscious is the higher layer. There's a middle layer, the collective unconscious on top, societal unconscious, and personal unconscious. So I'm introducing the idea that there's a societal unconscious, and that is reflected in many different ways. For example, there's bikers. Yesterday I was watching a news report about the big bike rally up in Sturgis, South Dakota, and obviously all the bikers have sort of a common idea within them, and maybe it is this sort of Fonz type person, because in the 1950s when we were coming up, people that were bikers were Hell's Angels, and they were criminals, basically. And it couldn't be farther from anybody's mind that their children should be involved with motorcycles and dressing like Hell's Angels. And yet, in order to rebel, a lot of young people did later decide to buy the leathers and to get themselves a big motorcycle and so on. Fortunately, Harley Davidson provided motorcycles that were big enough and comfortable enough to carry around the average overweight American. So anyway, the people that travel in that circle, in that social group, have a certain common unconscious idea. Now, the same would be true of Marines, for example. I was a Marine, and all Marines know some things that we can't possibly describe to anybody else. And so that's incredibly valuable when you're in battle and when you're with other Marines at the bar. It's invaluable in social life sometimes as well. And another example would be Annapolitans, which is, I live in Annapolis, Maryland, and so everybody that's an Annapolitan has a certain unconscious feeling, let's say, about Annapolis, and we all know some things about this place and so on, and those are all unconscious too. But above that is this collective unconscious, which applies to all men. So somewhere between this collective unconscious and the personal unconscious are where some of these issues fall in that are coming up in election 2018. So let me give you a few examples of the transpersonal unconscious in your life. So I've already given you the bikers in Sturgis, South Dakota, but let's think about what they're reliant on from a transpersonal unconscious level. First of all, they all drove to Sturgis because Sturgis only has 7,000 residents, and about 500,000 bikers come in during the 10-day period of the rally. And so they all came in on roads from all across the United States. Now, those roads were maintained by the various states that they passed through or by the federal government, and they were entirely reliant on perhaps several states to have their roads in good order so that they could pass through. And they were reliant on the weather, although they couldn't really control that. But let's take another one, which is their bikes. They're reliant on the manufacturer of their bikes to build a safe motorcycle that they can safely ride for very long distances in many cases. And they're reliant on all the equipment manufacturers of their leathers and their helmets. And the point about this being unconscious is that they are not thinking about these things. Of course, when they buy a bike, sure, they're thinking about the safety of the bike. But once they're out driving and have a little experience with it, and once they've bought their helmet and their leathers, they really don't think about those things anymore. That becomes unconscious, and they just ride. I'm going to go out on the bike right now. But they are really dependent on a very large collective. And another example is safety at both on the highway getting to the rally, and that involves police forces who are protecting motorcyclists from aggressive drivers, and it also has to do with safety at the rally. Now, it's pretty evident that those people are keeping themselves safe among themselves, and that's all to their credit. They're reliant on beers, and so they never think about whether the beer is properly brewed or anything like that. Maybe they do have a preference as to brand or something like that, but they're totally reliant on our systems across the country in various breweries to produce beer that is acceptable to the palate, is safe, and meets all their other expectations. And those are things they never really think about. They just go up to their bar and say, I want a bud, and they get a bud, and they never really think about the complexity of the manufacturing process that made the cans, that brewed the beer, that delivered it to their site. Women, they have to have women there because that's their wives and sweethearts, and so they're entirely dependent upon their behavior and the behavior of 500,000 people to be acceptable to women. And society at large. As I said, 50, 60 years ago, bikers had a pretty bad name in this country because they were seen as criminal gangs that were just going around on motorcycles. But today, they're basically middle-aged, many portly middle-class Americans who are just out to have a good time riding their motorcycles and to feel the power of their life, let's say, right there in their hands and between their legs, whatever it is. And what I want to emphasize in connection with election 2018 is that when I was on active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps, and when any member of our armed forces is on active duty, we're defending all of our fellow Americans, and I emphasize that includes those people, even though I don't perhaps agree with them from my own personal political perspective. But in terms of them being a fellow American, they're absolutely a fellow American, and they absolutely deserve my protection as a military officer. And, we put to rest any idea that there was anything else in the Marine Corps back in 1968, because, as you remember, there was a lot of bad blood between the black and white communities in 1968, especially because of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps, to his wisdom, gave a teaching to all commands, which is all Marines are green, and that's the end of it. There's no race in the Marine Corps. We're all green. And, although that wasn't carried out perfectly, it was pretty well carried out, and Marines can rely on one another in the field. Some of the best Marines I know are black men, for example, but, they're also green men, and they're people who suffered actually deplorable conditions in our country before the Vietnam time, and yet they were completely patriotic Marines and very reliable in combat and so on. And so what I'm trying to emphasize is that there's this whole ball of things that emanates out from all of us that is unconscious. And let's take parents, for example. If you go around your community, you pretty much understand how your fellow parents are going to behave toward their children. And obviously there are standards regarding child abuse and that sort of thing. But aside from that, we all around the world raise our children. I mean, children are born as wild animals, and we have to basically teach them how to live. And when they're born, obviously they're not civilized, and we have to teach them how to be civil in our world. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that the people who are in Sturgis are not deplorables, and obviously that was a very poor choice of words by Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election, because it reinforces this idea of divide and conquer. And if average Americans are divided into many atomized little groups, then we're never going to get what we need from our government. And what's truly shocking to me is that since this new administration was elected, after every single one of them ran on a platform of balancing the budget and making things better, as soon as they had the power, they voted themselves a $1.5 trillion tax cut. And, I don't know about you, but we didn't see that in my household. And I think my wife believes that she might have gotten a few extra dollars after taxes, but on the other hand, she had to pay more for something else. So the net was that it actually cost the average American money. But as soon as the GOP got power, they did the opposite of what they ran on. So let's see. Okay, another example is shaving. I was shaving at the gym the other day, and I was thinking about how dependent I am when I'm shaving at the gym locker room on many things. Like I'm first of all reliant on my security in the locker room when I'm not fully clothed. I'm reliant upon the safety of the safety razor and the manufacturers of the safety razor, and reliant on the designers of the safety razor all the way along, and the manufacturers of the mirror that I use to see myself while I'm shaving. I'm reliant on our security forces, be they police or military, all the way up in our various governments. And so all those things are unconscious, and that's a collective unconscious. It's more in this area that I talked about of societal unconscious, where we pretty much know what to expect in our society. So if you go to the grocery store tomorrow morning, there aren't going to be any surprises. And another example is traffic laws. We pretty much know what to expect out on the highway. People don't rigidly follow the law to the letter. They might go a little bit faster than the speed limit, or they might roll through a stop sign. But when they do that, they're making a godlike decision. And meanwhile, the fact that we have an understanding among us, all 310 million of us, that the traffic laws will be executed in a certain manner, and that may include the police allowing us to go 7 miles an hour over the speed limit without picking us up. But we unconsciously know what's acceptable in our society, and we just go out and never think about it in a day. Another is the treatment of women and children. And so obviously when women and children are badly treated in whatever environment, all of us rankle over that. Another area where we rely on the collective unconscious is our federal government, where we have many services. I get both military retirement and Social Security from the federal government, and I'm reliant on that. The funds come into my accounts every month reliably, but there's lots of people out there in the federal government that are making that run smoothly. And one of the issues that we have is our international negotiations, where our counterparties, the people with whom we're negotiating with, also have to have an unconscious reliance on us. Obviously, if you're negotiating with someone, you have to believe that they're true to their word and that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And then we take, in the same sense, the military, we have our ranks, our insignia of rank, and our ribbons. We wear our resume on our uniform. And when we see the rank of an individual, that tells us what layer of responsibility and experience that individual has, all the way from private up to 4-star general. And so when someone's a 4-star general, they've been through a lot, they've experienced a lot, we know we can rely on them. They didn't get promoted there just by accident. And by the same token, we can read the ribbons that someone wears on their uniform, and that tells other military people what they've been doing. And so all those things. So, and I just wanted to mention one other here before I go on, and that's the church. We rely on our pastor, and we rely on the building being there, that there are volunteers available, and that we rely on the liturgy that goes back 2,000 years, regardless of which liturgy we follow. And so all of those things happen unconsciously within our psyche, within our society. And they're not purely in the collective unconscious range that Dr. Jung talks about in terms of it being the same for everyone all around the world. Obviously, a lot of those issues that I just discussed are different in other parts of the world somewhat in terms of how they're done. But, by and large, humans are humans, and we don't find big differences among humans pretty much anywhere anymore. I mean, obviously there are a few Aboriginal peoples out there in the world, but not that many. So let me look. Thomas says, how does the societal unconscious differ from the collective unconscious, nationality, culture, regional? Yeah, exactly. Dr. Jung in this book is describing the collective unconscious as an unconscious that has gradients, basically ruts or archetypes. I'll describe that in a minute, that go back to way before antiquity, and they're common to all human beings. And so he's describing the collective unconscious there as items that are common to all human beings. And and obviously I read earlier the definition of the personal unconscious, which contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, subliminal perceptions, by which are meant sense perceptions that were not strong enough to reach consciousness, and contents that are not yet ripe for consciousness. So that's the personal unconscious. So between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious is this societal unconscious, which I don't think Dr. Jung really delineated, but certainly he talked about it a lot when he got into alchemy later on. And so this is about, so that societal unconscious is about alchemy. And I had a mentor who once said to me, every time you add somebody to a group or take someone away from a group, you change the group. And if you think about that in your life, you'll know the truth of that. And so obviously, if you're talking about something as big as a nation, adding or taking one person away isn't going to make that much difference. But if you're talking about a group of 4 drinking buddies, then adding or subtracting somebody might be a big change, and you just can't say. And so each one of these entities, whatever it is, whether it's the Marines or the congregation at church or the bikers up in Sturgis, all of those would be, from an alchemical point of view, an alchemical vase, a cauldron into which various ingredients are put, and out of those ingredients comes a certain way of being in the world. And so if you look at news reports about the bikers in Sturgis, the people are going to be pretty much as you would expect them to be. If you look at a U.S. Marine, they're pretty much going to be the way you expect them to be. and that goes for everybody. I mean, if you go to our local Presbyterian church, you're going to see people there that are pretty much like you would expect Presbyterians to be. Welcome, Andy. Glad to see you. And so that's why I'm trying to delineate sort of a different layer, because I think that it's important for us as Americans to recognize that we're all Americans, and we currently have a political environment that is very antagonistic to half the society, regardless of which side you're on. There's a true antagonism that's going on, and in a way that's unavoidable, as I'll discuss in a little while here, but also we all want to recognize that we are Americans, and we need to be Americans first, and we need to defend our country and have defense of our country. On that sort of point of patriotism, etc., I would agree 100% with the people that are in Sturgis. And so I have no disagreement with them in terms of patriotism or being an American. Where I disagree is things like kneeling for the national anthem at the NFL games. I believe that's a form of freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And, I swore my oath to defend that right. It doesn't mean I have to like that behavior. And I'm not saying that I do like that behavior. Obviously, I'm a person who, every time I hear colors, which is a bugle call, when the U.S. flag goes up and down, or anytime that I hear the U.S. national anthem, I say to myself the names of the 5 men that I know who've given up their lives to defend our country. And these are 5 men that I know personally, and in a couple of cases they were very close to me. And so obviously I have a strong feeling about patriotism and about the flag and about the national anthem, but that doesn't run to forbidding people to express if they have a gripe. Just as I was reading this letter earlier this evening from Dr. Jung, and he was griping to this Dr. Dorothy Hoke about how people treated him. Well, people have a right to gripe, and if we don't let them, then that psychic energy that is dammed up in there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on, it might get repressed, but it's going to come out in some other way, and it may not be a way that is acceptable to you. It's not going to go away. There's conservation of energy, and we're talking about psychic energy here. So if someone is going to put their psychic energy into kneeling for the national anthem at a football game, and then they're prohibited from doing that, then the next time you're going to hear that they're revolting in another way, and it may not be so easy. And so that's my view. And also I think that adds to the strength of our country, because it makes us understand that some of our citizens aren't feeling as American as you and I might feel, depending on who you are. And Thomas says, from a sociological perspective, it seems you're isolating a group consciousness and group unconsciousness at work. Yeah, I guess group consciousness, group unconsciousness, yes. In the sense of, if I'm conscious of being a Marine, I'm conscious of that. I'm wearing the uniform. I'm being a Marine in that way, but I also unconsciously feel some things with my brother Marines that I couldn't possibly explain, not because I don't want to, but because one learns them unconsciously and they remain unconscious, but nonetheless, my solidarity with my fellow Marines is 100%, and I think most Marines feel that way. So, but that would be true of Navy people or Army people or Air Force people or Coast Guard people also, but in their different way. They're not going to be the same. And so, yes, it is irrational. Thomas says, I tend to feel most patriotic when standing atop Mount Mitchell, North Carolina, looking at the mountains rolling away in attachment and feeling for the land itself rather than the institutions. Well, I certainly feel that way too. And, I think that a lot of us have sung patriotic songs through our school days where we imagined the beauty of our country from a physical point of view. And in fact, the National Symphony Orchestra has had a campaign going for years to change the national anthem from the Star-Spangled Banner to America the Beautiful. And I support that idea because I don't regard war as the best way to get things done in the world. And it's becoming less and less appropriate as we go on. And so we need to wake up and learn other ways of being in the world as a species, or we're simply not going to be here anymore. So beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. I drove across the United States with my parents 4 times before I was 6 years old. So I certainly have seen the country from a very early age, and in 1952, my father was transferred to Kodiak, Alaska, and we had been living on the Mojave Desert in California at Inyokern, and we drove back across the country to Philadelphia where my grandparents lived, and my father had to go to Kodiak ahead of us, and so he flew to Kodiak. But my mother was tasked with the job when she was 25 years old and had 3 children, me being the oldest at age 5, and my sister being 9 months old. She had the task of driving the 3 children across the United States in a Jeep station wagon. And before we left, my grandfather said, well, don't tell anybody that you see on the road, anybody at a gas station or anything like that, where you're going. He told my brother and me that. Of course, I was 5 and my brother was 3. And so every time we stopped at a gas station and we drove across South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington in that time, And so it was a very lonely drive, long distances between any housing at all. And my brother and I would say, "We're going to Alaska." And obviously, if our fellow Americans were not decent people, which they all were, of course, they could have easily robbed my mother and killed us or whatever out there in the Badlands, and no one would have known the difference. So I know the good heart. I know the good heart of all Americans. And yes, there are some exceptions, sadly. But I think that most Americans are reliable. And obviously, if you are American and live in the United States, you know well enough that we go about our business pretty securely these days. And with all of these things that we rely on in our unconscious, never thinking about, who built that church and will there be gas in the gas station and that sort of thing. In a lot of other countries, they do worry about that sort of thing. Andy says, nationalism is a hierarchical, emergent effect from the way our societies are constructed. Okay, I mean, yeah, that's what they are. Pattern recognition and tribalism aren't easily disposed of. Well, we don't have to emphasize them either, because if we keep emphasizing them, then we are just going to end up all being slaves to the bankers, because they've found a way to suck pretty much all of the juice out of the country. And I worry about my children and grandchildren, whether their investment in Social Security and Medicare will be there when they reach retirement age. I think I'm probably okay because I'll get grandfathered in, but I'm not sure that my children and grandchildren will be. And these are not, what do they call them? They're not entitlements. They're contracts with our government. And every single one of us has, if we've ever had a paycheck, has been paying into these systems our whole lives. And we have done our part. And so I think it's pretty arrogant for politicians to think that they can shave that away from us. I'm pretty angry about that idea, because these are contracts between me and my government, and if I'm going to be expected to put my life on the line to defend that government, then I expect the government to defend my rights too. And so Thomas says, in my days of hitchhiking long past, I was amazed at just how basically decent were the folks who picked me up, often going out of their way to help a stranger. Absolutely. I did a lot of hitchhiking, especially in college, and I never had a problem, and everyone was very happy to see me. My worry at the present moment is, how does America avoid becoming a latter-day Nazi Germany? Well, we do that by having discussions like this among ourselves and pointing out that we have an administration that's trying to get that kind of takeover of our government accomplished, and it is a worrisome thing. I have every confidence that it will ultimately lose, but the problem is that it took 23 years to squeeze Nazism out of Germany. And it didn't happen until all the crockery was broken. And so we all have to be vigilant for that. And we all have to try to be conscious about what we're agreeing to and what we aren't agreeing to. And it's truly frightening to see how the GOP has just gone over en masse to this kind of behavior. That's really troublesome. So Roger Film says, goofy systems, why wouldn't people save their own money? Well, Raji, I guess you're talking about Social Security and Medicare, and I think we're a century beyond the point where we think that everybody should save for themselves, because we did have a depression in this country. My mother-in-law, who's still with us here, went through that time, and it was a terrible time around the world, not only in the United States, but certainly in Germany it was terrible, and it started much earlier in Germany than it did for us, because they never really recovered from World War I. And so if you've ever followed what happened during the Depression, I think you wouldn't even ask that question, because it's not that simple. And, we had people in a lot of trouble during the Depression. Yeah, I guess it's fair to say that their money is never truly their own. And yes, it is true that we don't dictate the market value of money. And as we saw during the Nixon administration, when we had hyperinflation, things were bad then. I mean, if you had money, you were in good shape, but because you could have bigger returns on your bets. But if you were poor and had a fixed income, you were just getting squeezed right out of the system. And Thomas says most people live from paycheck to paycheck, and there's hardly enough left over for saving. That's absolutely true. And that's been true my entire life, even though I've had a very, many people would think it's an enviable business career, but it just never changes. And Andy says, us dying is more profitable than us living. In many cases, that's true. And Thomas says, downward mobility is happening today. And he talks about Robert Samuelson's article. Robert has written lots of articles over the years. But basically, we're at the mercy of the banks, and at some point I will do a series of videos about that, but I'm not going to do it right now, and I have my own personal reasons for that, but I'm not going to do it in conjunction with this election campaign at this moment. It's just atrocious what happened, because basically after the crash of 2008, the financial community got immediately paid to cover their losses, and that was in the form of something like $450 billion in the TARP package at the end of the W. Bush administration. But the economy collapsed, and they let it collapse. And the result was that lots of people lost their jobs, and lots of people had their homes foreclosed. And what happened was that then the financial industry managed to get themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages. So 10 million families roughly lost their homes in foreclosure, and the banks collected double on those because they first collected from the federal government, and then they went around and collected on the defaulted mortgages where people didn't know any better. And I've been digging in this manure pile for the last 8 years, and so I have a lot of stuff, but I'm not going to go into it further than that right now. And Andy, I've actually written 4 books, and you can see them all in the Dropbox. If you look there, you'll find them. 2 of them were written in my pen name. Thomas says, how much are we at the mercy of the collective of or societal unconscious of our given space and time? I wonder, is it escapable this side of life in a cave? Well, let's put it this way. The world is built like an onion, and so there are many layers, one on top of another, and I was extremely worried after election 2016 personally, and I still am, but so far we haven't been taken to another war, a new war per se, at least none that we know about, not leaving aside ones we might not know about. And I thought that was a distinct possibility. I still think it's a possibility. I think we're playing a lot of brinksmanship right now, which I don't think is terribly wise personally. And, you know, how do our allies rely on us? How do our opponents rely on what we will do if we keep changing the rules of the game all the time? That's not a very good way to run a country, I don't think. And but in fairness, I do think that our national systems have been robust enough to cope with the current situation up till now. And so I think that we can look forward to that continuing. Now, that isn't to say that we're out of the woods, and I'm not saying that we're out of the woods because, you know, it took Hitler 10 years to go from 7 guys in a room talking to one another to being the Chancellor of Germany, elected by the biggest margin in history before Angela Merkel. And so, and that happened in, I guess, 1933 or 1934. And so that run-up took 10 years, and then he had 6 years where he was sort of on top and he was getting everything he wanted, and then finally he started a war that ultimately destroyed not only him but his entire country. And so that's not beyond the realm of possibility. Psychic epidemic is a reality, and it can happen. Even election 2016 was a kind of psychic epidemic. And so we have to be vigilant, and we have to be serious about what we expect our country to be, and mature about it. Let's see. Andy says, those enlightened enough to understand there even is a cave can figure this out. Yeah, I'm not so sure, Andy. Although it seems to be a question of what we can know, given we're inside this particular universe. Well, yeah, I mean, who knows what's really going on? But let me get further into this teaching for tonight. I don't want to completely set it aside. So I asked the question then, which I've often mentioned, and you may have heard me say it before, but what one factor makes the USA stronger than other countries? And I asked that question around the world for 15 years as I traveled. And I traveled, for example, to India 44 times between 1994 and 2013. And I went to Saudi Arabia 23 times between 2002 and 2013 or so. And many other countries. I mean, I traveled very widely. I've traveled in 12 Muslim countries, just for instance. And so I asked a very wide variety of people what one factor above all others makes the United States a unique country. And it's a stump the stars question. Nobody could really answer it. And whether they had a PhD or a guy at a gas station, nobody knows why. And so I had to reflect on it quite a lot, and I did reflect on it quite a lot for 15 years. And what I came to is, first of all, our diversity, namely that we have Americans from every culture in the world, from every racial, ethnic group, from every religion, from every country of origin. And when those people come here, they become Americans. And I'm talking about this unconscious American category, and it happens pretty quickly. Even somebody like Khizr Khan, who himself came as an adult and had his son in the United States, who ultimately was the man that was killed as a captain in the army. But even he is very strong about what his Americanism is, okay? And I had the privilege, here in Annapolis, we have some colonial homes that belonged to signers of the Declaration of Independence, and every year at Paca House it's called, which is a stone's throw from the U.S. Naval Academy and a stone's throw from the State House of the state of Maryland. But every year on the 4th of July, they have a new American swearing-in ceremony. And I had the privilege to go to it one year. And, it's just remarkable to see the different people. I think that particular day there were people from 23 national origins. And, we were talking with them about the principles of being an American. And those people know it better than the average 10th generation American does. And I told them, if we forget, please remind us, because those are the principles that made this country great. And it wasn't divisiveness. And, we've all fought together. But the other thing that makes us very strong is our debate. And so, as distasteful as it is, the fact is that every time a good idea comes up from any group, it's adopted. And every time a bad idea comes up from any group, it's debated out of the system one way or another. And so the result of that process after 400 years is that, our national defense, our economy, and all those other issues have bubbled to the top. And you can tell it's still working because we still have people wanting to immigrate into the United States, probably from every country in the world, a net inflow from every country. And I don't think that there's any country that is getting a net outflow of Americans. And I don't think there's any other country in the world that can say they're getting a net inflow. So why is that? What is it that people want here? And, it is the freedom to speak our minds, to tell one another what we think. I think that's the essence of it. And if we do that, then we become stronger. And as I have looked at many countries around the world, which don't allow dissent, they're not strong. They're not, their economies aren't booming. And this includes Russia. I mean, Russia, the Soviet Union used to be comparable in economy to the United States, but Russia today is equivalent to the economy of Italy. And so their way of behaving toward their people has held them back. And we have to understand that when good ideas emerge and we adopt them, it makes us stronger. And, I always point to Starbucks, which is an idea that emerged from a known Zionist. But nonetheless, because it was a good idea, there are four Starbucks cafes in King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And there, if you look around the skyline of Riyadh, you see McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, you name it. And the man who brought me to Saudi Arabia the first time, on the first day that we were together, took me out to an overlook over Riyadh, and he said, Skip, in 20 years, Saudi is going to be like the States. And, I was looking out and I said, wow, I mean, it looks like Southern California to me now. And so, obviously they have some changes that they have to make within their society, unique to their society. But, nonetheless, I think we don't know a lot of things about countries like that we should know. So Andy says, have you experienced more of an empathy for living things since you got into archetypal psychology? Seems like there's an almost Buddhist quality to altruism. Let's see. Empathy for living things. Well, actually, Andy, I don't have a lot of empathy for living things because I've always suffered from allergies. And when I was a 2-year-old baby, I was suffering very badly from asthma. And my father was able to parlay that into 3 years on the Mojave Desert for an assignment in the Navy. And that cured my asthma because there's nothing green that grows in the Mojave Desert. And medicine has since figured out that it was caused by allergies, that these problems are. But I've struggled with allergy all my life, and I still go every 2 weeks and get 2 allergy shots every 2 weeks to this day. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for everything that's green and grows. I'm allergic to most of it. But somehow I manage. And people ask me how I got along in Vietnam, and the answer is, I think I just had so much adrenaline going in Vietnam all the time that kept my allergies under control. But anyway, let me go on here. So anyway, this process of debate and the process of accepting the good ideas and rejecting the bad ideas is a process like tempering steel. And that's made the country stronger and stronger. And so, whereas a country like Germany in the 1920s was susceptible to the type of thing that happened with the Nazis, because everybody was on their back financially. People were having to take wheelbarrows full of money to the store to buy a loaf of bread. And so they would have accepted anybody who would make things better for them. But I think in the U.S. we have some different features today, and I think that our country is very deep. I think that the president did not anticipate how deep and how much like an onion the federal government is built. I mean, it's, putting somebody who's not a politician into the top job, that would be like taking somebody who's a second lieutenant and making them a division commander. And, obviously that wouldn't wash in any armed force. And we're seeing the problems that it engenders when we take a businessman who has no experience with government or military and just put him in the presidency. It's an issue. So anyway, so in paragraph 76, Dr. Jung is talking about psychic energy, which he says is libido. Now, libido for Freud was the sex drive, but for Dr. Jung, when he talked about libido, he was talking about psychic energy. And so remember, in physics, E equals mc squared, and the fact that there is conservation of energy. And so we have psychic energy too. We supply it by various means, and it bounces around. It's conserved, but it also comes in through our food and through our water and so on. But it also bounces around, and if it gets repressed, it's going to get repressed down into the unconscious, where it's not going to go away. Okay, so anyway, he says, psychic energy is a very fastidious thing which insists on fulfillment of its own conditions. We cannot make it serviceable until we have succeeded in finding the right gradient. Now, by gradient, I think if you had an image of a rut in a dirt road after a rainstorm, you might think of that as a gradient. But obviously what he's talking about is pathways of synaptic firings through a series of neurons. So when I say a certain word, whatever it is, that word will immediately fire neurons in your mind, and that will bring up an image. Now, every word is seen differently in our imagery, and so I can't predict what it will be. But if I say the word Mercedes-Benz, now everybody that's listening to this has had synaptic firings going back through their neurons, but everybody's image of a Mercedes-Benz is different. And if I say Volkswagen Bug, again, it's different. Is yours yellow, or is it blue, or is it red, or is it black, or white, or what color? Is it a 1953 Bug that had the two small back windows and the stripe down the middle, or is it a more modern Bug like the ones that have come out recently? So all those things are psychic gradients. And so what Dr. Jung is talking about here is gradients that have existed for a long time. And they're also the archetypes, obviously. So, for example, the mother archetype, obviously when certain things happen in your life, you become pregnant, and certain things happen in the psyche, which have happened to all mothers since time immemorial, and they all work in the same way. And so those are the archetypes. So the same with warrior. If the United States were attacked tonight, we'd have all American men working together. There wouldn't be any issue of blue state or red state. And in fact, in the American military, political activity is not allowed. So, but the warrior archetype would be engendered, and the same is true of the lover archetype, or the king archetype, or the high priestess. All those archetypes have certain gradients that are all within all of us, and if certain things happen, they are going to they're going to fire off and do things. So in paragraph 77, then even the most strenuous exertions in analysis would not have sufficed had there not been present at the same time a gradient in that direction. So in other words, an analyst in a psychotherapy can't just convince somebody. It's not a matter of logic. They have to understand what the gradients likely are in the psyche, namely the archetypes, and then they have to see a way clear to bring one's mind into that gradient. And so paragraph 78 then, life can flow forward only along the path of the gradient, but there is no energy unless there is a tension of opposites. So we have to have a tension of opposites. It either has to draw us together or pull us apart, but it's because of those opposites that we have energy at all. And it's a process. So Dr. Jung used to use the example of the waterfall, where the water comes over the waterfall, and obviously that has potential energy in it, and which can be captured. And then when the water gets down to the sea, then it re-evaporates up and goes back to the top of the waterfall and comes down again. And that's a continuing process. And that process creates energy and gives us the water we need. Sorry, let me just back up. Thomas says, I've been thinking about how Buddha posits the non-existence of the self, or self. Anatta is the phrase which would seem to make it problematic for Jungians. The way it's been described by Dr. Edinger that I know of is that the Buddha was on the self end of the spectrum, and Christ was on the ego end. And so in Buddhist meditation, we actually are trying to just go communicate directly with the self. That's what meditation does. And Buddhism is a very complicated philosophy, but it all comes down to it is about self, but it's about self in the pleroma, basically. So it's about big picture self, which Edinger talked about. I think what you're thinking of, maybe, Thomas, is the non-existence of ego. That ego, one is trying to leave behind the ego in Buddhism, and obviously that works to a degree. My criticism of Buddhism is that it tends to make very passive people, and very quiet, passive people, which is maybe okay when you only have $1 a day for everybody to live on, but it's a question about whether you can survive that way, and so there has to be a middle ground between self and ego. And then Thomas is separating out personal unconscious dream contents, symbols from collective unconscious contents. Symbols is such a challenging yet rewarding endeavor, useful for fiction writing also, absolutely. And if you're fiction writing, I urge you to stick with the archetypes, and they're in the collective unconscious and they resonate with everyone. And that doesn't mean that you don't have personal experience of the archetypes that you can bring into your writing, but start with the stories of the famous myths, basically, and then build another world around those myths, because those myths have the archetypes in them. Andy says, I believe the person who truly understands the collective unconscious could completely overpower 1 billion morons. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Well, the problem is that you don't have to understand the collective unconscious as our president exemplifies, because what I understand from my psychologist friends is that the president has a very little ego, which is exemplified by the fact that he's a classic bully. And, even my father taught me when I was in the 4th grade that a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And that has proven true throughout my life. And so the problem is that his ego has been overwhelmed by the collective, and so he's been overwhelmed by archetypal energies, and he has no control of that. And I'll get to that in a little bit later here, but it makes someone who has that kind of inflation lose touch with reality, honestly. And at least that's my opinion, and I think it's backed by many mental health professionals who've written books about it. But anyway, and so anyway, my point to you, Andy, is that I'm sure our president does not understand the concept of the collective unconscious. He's the opposite of that, but he has been taken over by it, and therein is our peril. So let me see. All right, so we have to have this tension of opposites, because if we don't, nothing happens. And one of the reasons that lots of stuff happens in the United States is that we work everything out, maybe painfully, but it's the process that has worked for us. And so hence it's necessary to discover the opposite to the attitude of the conscious mind. So whatever your conscious mind thinks about whatever it is, try to discover in your own unconscious what the opposite of that is, because therein is a flow of energy, and if you can harness that, then you've found the transcendent function, and that makes you very strong. But that's a very hard thing to do without getting in serious trouble. And so you either want to know a lot about what Dr. Jung was teaching, or you want a good therapist with you, because once the unconscious gets a hold of you and takes a hold of you, what they say is when you go into depth, the first thing you run into is the devil. And I've certainly experienced that personally, and I've experienced a vision of Mephistopheles himself plopping down right next to me in my car. And so I've been working with my unconscious for quite a long time now, and there be monsters down there, and you better have control of it, and that means that you need a strong ego, and that means you need to have gone through the Job archetype as many times as possible. Okay, so there were Jung then was talking about the historical theories of neurosis. Freud said it was all about eros. Adler said it was a will to power. Logically, the opposite of love is hate, and of eros is phobos, or fear. But psychologically, it is the will to power. So where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking. The one is but the shadow of the other, and I think that we can see that in our current administration, where there are many power mongers, but there's lacking love and very little empathy for example, the children on the border. But nonetheless, life is born only of the spark of opposites, ergo the United States and its incessant debates. Moving on here. Let's see, Okay, so there, one issue that Dr. Jung is talking about in paragraph 80 is the difference between introversion and extroversion, which is idealism and materialism. And so the extroverted materialist is the person that owns a 63-foot yacht, which I showed you the picture of a while ago. I don't know if I can bring it up again. I probably don't have it here. No. I don't have it right handy, but remember I showed you a photograph of a 63-foot power yacht, and the name of it was Never Enough. Well, a materialist is never going to have enough, and but they're not going to have happiness also. And so you need to have a balance between your spiritual side and your introverted and your extroverted sides. And so the introvert thinks and considers before acting. And so in terms of election 2018, we have Mr. Mueller as the introvert, and the extrovert finds that unknown situations fascinate him. His action is swift, with no misgivings, no reflections on, I wonder what will happen if I throw my son under the bus, type thing. He just doesn't think about that. And so that's the perfect extrovert. And the problem is that the two sides have never understood one another. Now, Dr. Jung was talking about a marriage between an extrovert and an introvert, but just consider it in the context of the face-off between the president and Mr. Mueller. I'm still in paragraph 80. Paragraph 80 is one of these interminable Jung paragraphs. It's about 2.5 pages long, but anyway, I'm going to quote from it. But when the man has made enough money, or if a fine legacy like the presidency should drop from the skies and external necessity no longer presses, then they have time to occupy themselves with one another. Hitherto they stood back to back and defended themselves against necessity, but now they turn face to face and look for understanding, only to discover that they have never understood one another. Each speaks a different language. When the conflict between the two types begins, then the conflict between the two types begins. The struggle is envenomed, brutal, full of mutual depreciation, even when conducted quietly and in the greatest intimacy. For the value of the one is the negation of the value of the other. It might be reasonably supposed that each, conscious of his own value, would peaceably recognize the other's value, and that in this way any conflict would be superfluous. I've seen a good number of cases where this line of argument was adopted without, however, arriving at a satisfactory goal. So Dr. Jung wrote that 102 years ago, and obviously that was before our president was born and before Mr. Mueller was born, but he seems to me he predicted our situation pretty much. So paragraph 84, sensitiveness is a sure sign of the presence of inferiority. So the fact that we see the president being extremely sensitive right now means that he's feeling very inferior internally. Then he goes on, the essence of the inferior function is autonomy. It is independent, it attacks, it fascinates, and so spins us about, that we are no longer masters of ourselves and can no longer rightly distinguish between ourselves and others. So, is that going on in the U.S.? I think so. Paragraph 94. It is unhappily the case that no man can direct the so-called disposable energy, libido, at will. It follows its own gradient. Indeed, it had already found its gradient even before we set the energy free from the unserviceable form to which it was linked. Then he refers to the primordial images, the most ancient and the most universal thought forms of humanity. They are as much feelings as thoughts. Indeed, they lead their own independent life, rather in the manner of part souls. And I think last week I gave the example of my vision of the dinosaur when I was about 6 years old. Obviously, that image was in my ancestors for many millions of years, because I never knew of a dinosaur like that one, which I saw. And so let's see. So Fred says, Thomas says, our society is extroverted at heart, is it not? Absolutely. And Dr. Jung regularly commented on that. I've seen him comment on that many times about the American psyche. And Fred says, the thing is, I don't get motivated to do anything, relationships, business, success, hobbies, etc., since I am in a nihilistic, confused state of asking WTF, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, am I doing here? Well, I'm not a mental health professional, Fred, so I wouldn't presume to solve existential dilemma like that on a YouTube live stream. But you might want to check with a mental health professional, and I urge you to do that. And the other thing is just start reading Dr. Jung, which is what I did 31 years ago. And I found that he basically served as my psychotherapist, even though he died long before I needed him. But nonetheless, I've been able to use his books. And so I would urge you to consider doing that, because that you may find that helpful. Thomas says, Susan Cain's Quiet, the Power of Introverts in the World That Can't Stop Talking, goes into this deeply. It's a great work. I bought it, and unfortunately I gave it to my mother-in-law. I never got to read it myself, but I definitely would like to. Alien says, I wonder if Symbols of Transformation is an interstellar account of how intelligent life forms get off the home planet. Well, not quite, Alien, but nice try. Fred, in my opinion, there's no such thing as introverts. Introverts usually are filled with insecurities, so they cannot blossom and express themselves in their highest form. Extrovertedness due to fear. Well, I don't concur with you, Fred, that extrovertedness is a higher form. Being an introvert, I think that these things are relatively balanced, and as you see, I'm managing to express myself in the form of now, I believe, 695 videos. So I'm a pretty introverted guy, but I managed to express myself pretty well. At least you're all here, so something's happening. Thomas says, Cain talks about how introverts learn how to fake extroversion in order to survive in the Western world. Yeah, I suppose there's a element of truth in that. And Alien, that's not true. If you're an intelligent introvert, you don't have to be insecure to prefer small interaction. Well, no, you don't have to be insecure. And my way of talking about this is an extrovert goes to a party and wants to yuck it up with a lot of friends, and an introvert wants to stand over in the corner with one or two people and talk. And so that's what I'm doing here. This is an introverted function here. But nonetheless, we managed to get our points across. And I certainly have been able to do so through my career, even though I'm a pretty serious introvert, because in my youth I kept having to move between schools, and that required me to be introverted for a period of time in each new school. So I learned to be quiet until I understood my environment. Thomas, I'm fortunate in knowing why I'm here, to write and to avoid small talk as much as possible. Very sensible. I loaned the Cain book out myself. And when you loan a book, it never comes back, boy. Fred, but introverts are extroverted in certain situations. They can be quite loud and exciting in situations where they feel safe and aloof in others. Sure, I mean, I have given public talks with 1,000 people in the room, so I managed to do it. Thomas, extrovert comes in the door, says, I'm here, while the introvert comes in the door, says, there you are. Okay, that's a good one. I like that. I may have to use that one. Fred says, we are social creatures. We are naturally extroverted until traumas and life experiences cause you to slowly crawl inside your shell. That's unless you have certain genetic predisposition like autism. Okay, I don't know about that. This is all from experience and personal opinion. I'm not claiming to be 100% correct. Yep, okay. And I'm not disputing what you say. I do acknowledge that, when I was pulled up out of my elementary school classrooms many times and moved across the country and dropped down in another one where the class had already formed 2 months earlier, and so I was kind of a fifth wheel all the time until I could find my way into the group. That does tend to cause introversion. So carrying on here, I need to hustle here. So, paragraph 94, it is unhappily the case that no man can direct the so-called disposable energy at will. It follows its own gradient. Indeed, it had already found its gradient even before we set the energy free from the unserviceable form to which it was linked. I guess I read that. All right, paragraph 105. We have now found the object which the libido chooses when it is free from the personal infantile form of transference. It follows its own gradient down into the depths of the unconscious and there activates what has lain slumbering from the beginning. It has discovered the hidden treasure upon which mankind ever and anon has drawn, and from which it has raised up its gods and demons, and all those potent and mighty thoughts without which man ceases to be man. Paragraph 108. The question now arises, whence came this new idea that thrusts itself upon consciousness with such elemental force, and whence did it derive the power that could so seize upon consciousness that it completely eclipsed the multitudinous impressions of a first voyage to the tropics? The idea of energy and its conservation must be a primordial image that was dormant in the collective unconscious. Such a conclusion naturally obliges us to prove that a primordial image of this kind really did exist in the mental history of mankind and was operative through the ages. As a matter of fact, the proof can be produced without much difficulty. The most primitive religions in the most widely separated parts of the earth are founded upon this image. That's primitive energetics. This concept is equivalent to the idea of soul, spirit, God, health, bodily strength, fertility, magic, influence, power, prestige, medicine, as well as certain states of feeling which are characterized by the release of effects. This power concept is also the earliest form of a concept of God among primitives. That is why it lies ready to hand in the unconscious of every man. Paragraph 110. They exert a fascinating and possessive influence upon the conscious mind and can thus produce extensive alterations in the subject. One can see this in religious conversions, in cases of influence by suggestion, and particularly at the onset of certain forms of schizophrenia. The mistake he makes comes from attributing to a person the contents of the collective unconscious. In this way, he makes himself and his partner either God or devil. Here we see the characteristic effects of the archetype. It seizes hold of the psyche with a kind of primeval force and compels it to transgress the bounds of humanity. It causes exaggeration, a puffed-up attitude, inflation, loss of free will, delusion, and enthusiasm in good and evil alike. The idea of an all-powerful divine being is present everywhere, consciously if not unconsciously, or unconsciously if not consciously, because it is an archetype. No matter how beautiful and perfect man may believe his reason to be, he can always be certain that it is only one of the possible mental functions and covers only that one side of the phenomenal world which corresponds to it. But the irrational, that which is not agreeable to reason, rings it about on all sides, and the irrational is likewise a psychological function. In a word, it is the collective unconscious, whereas the rational is essentially tied to the conscious mind. Remember enantiodromia, we need both the rational and the irrational. Okay, I'm almost done here. Paragraph 112, the only way out is to recognize that which you are not. Okay, so the point here is that you have to consider what you are, then recognize that which you are not, and realize that that is within you. Of course, that would never happen with our president, but in any case, paragraph 113, it is essential in differentiating the ego from the non-ego that a man should be firmly rooted in his ego function. That is, he must fulfill his duty to life so as to be in every respect a viable member of the community. All that he neglects in this respect falls into the unconscious and reinforces its position, so that he is in danger of being swallowed up by it. But the penalties for this are heavy. As Sinuous opined of old, it is just the inspired soul that becomes God and demon, and as such suffers the divine punishment of being torn asunder like Zagreus. Paragraph 114. In the case of an older person, we must nurture everything that assists the descent. We must nurture everything that assists the descent. So, okay, that's most of what I had to say about the collective unconscious. Let's see. So Fred says, I've known popular, extroverted people adapt at any situation and make friends and have a nice social circle and found them to have very high self-esteem. Me, on the other hand, have low confidence. Well, that's knowing that is the first step to a solution, I think. And few friends and can't express myself well with others. Well, you seem to be doing fine here, Fred, so I think that, you're on the mend. Andy says, do you believe in true state of Negretto can only be reached by divine intervention? I don't think divine intervention is necessarily required. Fred says, may I ask, what is Negretto? Negretto is sort of the bottom of the pits if you're working with alchemy, but alchemy is a topic which Dr. Jung wrote 3 books that big on, so I'm not really going to get into it. Thomas says, Wikipedia gives a good definition, Ray alchemy, anyway, Negretto is the phrase to search for, and so I'm glad. So I guess I'm glad you liked it, Thomas. I'm going to make a crazy prediction here. on account of I do have this facility for intuition, and it may not be correct, but in terms of what is going on in our society right now, as we look at the news and so on, it seems to me that we're sort of in the end times for the president. And what I have said a number of times on Twitter, so it's no secret, is that I believe there is not going to be an indictment of the president. I believe there's not going to be an impeachment of the president. And I believe there is not going to be a trial of the president. What I do believe is that at some point in the not terribly distant future, he will be approached by certain people who he cannot deny, and he will have to make a bargain to get out with his skin and with the skin of his children. And I thought this last quote, paragraph 114, in the case of an older person, we must nurture everything that assists the descent. And so, not wishing ill to the Trump family in any way, I think that what will happen is that the president is going to have to negotiate a way out of his predicament, because things are going to get very bad if he doesn't. And I don't think the other powers that be in the country will allow that to happen. And, you know, I wouldn't expect either the president, his son-in-law, or his daughter to go to jail, but they're going to have some embarrassing times. And let's see. Fred, thank you for your comment. And Fred says Trump drinks so much Diet Coke. Well, I used to drink a lot of it too. When I was in Vietnam, I drank half a case a day, believe it or not, when I wasn't in the field. It was warm most of the time. I mean, I've never been so cold as I've been in Vietnam when the hooch was 40 degrees, but in the summertime, it's quite warm. So Thomas says, well, maybe he'll resign in exasperation. I don't think his handlers are going to allow him to just resign and walk away, but I think that there may be movement behind the scenes to set something up that will give him a way out, and he can either have the excuse of for health reasons, or whatever other excuse he wants to come up with, and he'll negotiate a way to save his family. But that's what I expect will happen. Fred says, did I miss anything? Did Trump get himself into trouble recently? Well, this morning, it was either this morning or yesterday morning, but I think it was this morning. No, maybe yesterday morning. He acknowledged that the meeting in Trump Tower was just a normal campaign thing, seeking dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russians. That was just a normal campaign thing, and everybody does it. I'm sorry, anybody that had been involved with security clearances and defending the nation against Russia for the last 50 years knows that that's complete and utter crap. But anyway, he basically threw his son under the bus and said that his son lied to the Congress and other places. So now we're talking about felonies, and this isn't just a little deal. This is a big deal. And it's gotten worse and worse, and he knows it. And his crazed behavior is proving it. And remember the old idea of the scapegoat. We can't hold our guilt inside us. If we can, we have very strong egos if we can do that. And so what people usually do is blame their misbehavior on someone else. And so the more the president says that it wasn't me, the more it looks to me like it was him. And it's just not going to work. So Fred says, there's a card game, Illuminati card game, with a card depicting a man who looks like Trump and predicts assassination through a sniper. Cards confirm 9/11 and other major conspiracies. Well, I wouldn't expect that Mr. Trump is going to have that kind of a situation. But I do think he's going to be leaving office. And Thomas says, wasn't Watergate burglary about finding dirt on one's political opponents? Precisely, Thomas. That's exactly what it was about. And stealing information from the Democratic National Committee again. And so it's it's a big issue. But so my gut tells me that we aren't going to see an impeachment. We're not going to see a trial of the president, and we're not going to see an attempted indictment of the president. We will see a report, and I do believe he will leave office, and either very soon or shortly after the first of the year, one of the two, because the Republicans can't let the controversy go into the September or October campaign season. So it's either got to happen soon, maybe by the end of August, or it won't happen until after the first of the year. But the longer it takes, the uglier it's going to get, is what I predict. And I would be very, very surprised if what the Mueller investigation is about is just this one meeting in Trump Tower. I think that there's much, much more there, and we're going to see a lot of stuff coming out. And Mark Warner, the senator from Virginia, said about 3-4 weeks ago that there would be various revelations coming out through the summer, and then indictments will be coming after September 1st. And so, knowing what I know from watching the Nixon situation, I just don't believe that it is viable anymore. So anyway, thanks, Thomas, for coming. And yep, Fred, that's the best answer. Yep, make a mistake every day. If you're not making a mistake every day, you're not trying hard enough. And that's a way to build your ego. It's not necessarily a way to be individuated, but it certainly is a way to build your ego so that you can handle the slings and arrows of life. That's the key. And so Harry Putter says, what are my views on Europe? Do you think the current mass immigration will lead to fascism? Well, that's certainly a risk, Harry. But, you know, I have a psychology professor friend up at Skidmore College named Sheldon Solomon, and he's written several books on so-called terror management theory, and this is terror of death, not terror as in terrorism. But in any case, his answer for what was going on in Iraq back in the early 2000s was, instead of dropping bombs, we should drop bags of money. And if we had done that, we would have had a much better situation today. And so I think the immigration problem, both people coming to the United States and people coming into Europe, can be resolved if we stop doing what we're doing and thinking that we can stop it by walls and that sort of behavior, and rather look into how we can become the leaders of the free world, as I thought we were doing until well, at least I thought we were doing that until Reagan took power. But anyway, I'm trying to remember when we were leaders of the free world. But if we and the Western Europeans take on the role of leaders and help other countries to solve their problems, then that will solve the immigration problems. That's what I think. And, you know, it is possible that if we don't get smart, it will lead to fascism. That's the other way to go, and it's not a good one, because in my view, that leads to breaking all the crockery, which is what happened at the end of World War II. Fred says, sounds similar to Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, what humans do to distract themselves from their impending death. Right. That's terror management theory refers directly to Ernest Becker's work and the book Denial of Death, and it's an excellent book. I urge you all to read it. And among other things, I recall Bill Clinton said that he took it on his honeymoon. Why you bring Denial of Death on your honeymoon, I don't know. But anyway, I urge everyone to read that book. And I have no problem about Memento Mori and so on, because my house is entirely about death. I live with my wife is a Buddhist teacher, and Buddhism is all about death. And then she works at Hospice of the Chesapeake, and she visual volunteers with people who are actively dying, and she's a certified funeral celebrant. So I get plenty of death every day. So anyway, okay, I have to cut it off because we're already 13 minutes over. So there's a good chance I'll lose a big part of this on YouTube. So good night, and thank you for coming. By the way, I think that what I got an idea to do next week is work on Dr. Jung's essay, The Psychology of Conscience. And I have to find where that is. But if you want to get a head start of it, you can go into the Dropbox and find volume 20, which is the index of the collected works. And there you can look up the psychology of conscience, find where it is in the collected works, and then you can take a look at that volume. But it's a distinction between ethics and morality. That's one of the big issues in that essay. And so I think that at this time in our nation's history, that would be a good one to understand what Dr. Jung was saying about it. So I'm going to say goodnight to you, and See you next week. Thank you for visiting.